En la parte de UTPB y the Odessa Arts Council y de Latin American Writers Series, le quisiera decir gracias por su participación en esta discusión. Yo soy Bob Perry, enseño ciencias políticas aquí en UTPB. Nuestro invitado distinguido es Dr. Martin Van Delden, quien discutirá la obra de Octavio Paz. A él le quisiera decir gracias por venir. So, okay. My name is Bob Perry. I teach political science here. And Antonio Moreno, Dr. Moreno, asked me to give a little bit of a discussion by way of introduction to Dr. Van Delden. So I've taught for several times over several years a class in Latin American politics. And there's something that's always fascinated me about Latin American politics and just politics in general is this notion of identity. And to begin with, a true confession is I am puro güero, okay? There's no doubt about that. So, yet I grew up in Los Angeles, very close to Latin American culture. I had a fascination with Mexico, went down there several times. I had the opportunity to travel to Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil for a little bit as well. So very much enjoyed it and very much look forward to taking part in this with Dr. Van Delden. And so wanted, as I say, Antonio asked me to talk a little bit about Latin American identity, and I say I'm not an insider, if you will. I'm an outsider looking in. So you have to say I've given you that true confession, and you have to take that for what it's worth. If you want to tell me how mistaken I was at the end, great, bring it on, not a problem. So to begin with, when we talk about identity, particularly of the Latin American, so much of that identity comes from the outside, from outsiders looking at Latin America and Latin Americans. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but all these have been used to describe people from the Americas, Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Mexicans, so forth. So which of those is the most correct? I don't know. There's my answer to begin with. So I will point out that in my travels, certainly you see so much diversity in Latin America. And those of you that had my class before, you've seen these pictures before. I call this Find the Mexican. Can you do it? No, so on the upper left, that gentleman is actually from Uruguay. Okay, so what's the telltale mark? The yerba mate in the thermos. Those of you that have me in class now know every morning I bring my mate. So that's, I got addicted to it when I was down in Argentina. The picture to the upper right is a group of students. I just asked them, ¿puedo tomar su foto? Can I take your picture? So they were just high school kids. This was in Concepción del Uruguay, Argentina. And so it's a very diverse culture there, very diverse people. Now at the bottom, if you were playing along with the game, if you chose the bottom, you won. There's the Mexican. So that was at Quinta Gameros about 20 years ago. UTPB used to have an exchange program with the university there, a summer exchange program. Dr. Aguila participated one year with us. And in that, it was a language thing and a cultural exchange. And so we got to witness a dance sponsored or shown by each of the 31 states of Mexico. So I don't remember which state that is. Can someone tell me? Okay, no winners for that game. Okay, so then we move on to the next one. And so these are the terms that you so often hear as Hispanic and Latino. I think those have been used for the longest time. And neither of those words came from the Americas, right? España was a section of the Roman Empire known as España. The eastern part would later be called España, and the people there were referred to as Hispanicus. And then the people in the west would be Lusitania, which would eventually be Portugal. And so, as I say, that name was adapted to those in the Americas, anyone who had any heritage from the Iberian Peninsula. So that would be all the Spanish descendants and the Portuguese descendants. Now later on, the term Latin America was actually a geographic term. When map makers were making maps of the Americas, they wanted to distinguish between the white northern North America, Canada and the United States, and the less white, if you will, the Americas. So they referred to that as Latin America. So say it's not a name that the Americans or the indigenous develop for themselves. So say you've got these two, if you will, foreign terms to describe these people. Now with that, with this outside terminology, there's always been, and there's no doubt about it, there's always been a degree of racism in this naming of other people. And so this, if you've ever had a class in Latin American politics or the history, you know that there was a system of las castas, the caste system. And no doubt it was a very racist one, where the peninsulares, see, from Spain, they were the purest of the pure, they were the whitest of the white, if you will. And they, of course, particularly the sailors and the soldiers who came over from Spain and Portugal would mix with the indigenous, and they would produce a new class, and classes. And so later on you would have Africans coming as well. And this, no doubt, is a pecking order. At the top of it, as I say, are the peninsulares, those born and raised in Spain who would come to the Americas. And when they would, I don't know of another way to put it, interbreed with the indigenous people, they would produce the first mestizo class. And then later on, the Africans would come in, and you'd have all kinds of mixes there. I'm not going to go through these, but you see there's 16 different classes. So the lowest of the low, if you will, is when a black, I can't even read it here, but when a black meets with an Indian, you know, negro y indio, right? Or that would be India, pardon. Negro y India. That would produce the lowest class. So I say there's always been a racist, if you will, class system there. So then these terms, back to those terms, Hispanic and Latino, remember, as I say, they're outside terms. And I think it's fascinating as a political scientist to see how the government, the US government, has used these terms. So Hispanic, that was first used after the Treaty of Guadalupe. I mean, as an official government term. It was used to say they would categorize Mexican Americans as white, according to this original census, or censi, would that be the plural? I don't. Doesn't matter, right? Just shut up, Harry. Move on. Okay, so in those censuses, they say the government would refer to these people as white. And beginning around the 1930s, you see there the US government attempted to categorize people because we want to distinguish between black, indigenous, and European descent. So they developed the term there. And you see this quote, according to the Pew Research Center, census records from 1930 show that in that year the government counted Latinos under the catch-all category Mexican. So anyone from the Americas was often referred to as Mexican. And that's why that first slide I kind of show you, it's a little bit ironic to say which one is the Mexican, when 100 years ago they would have all been called Mexicans. And so during the Nixon administration, late 60s, early 70s, the government would begin to use Hispanic as a racial and ethnic category in the US Census. So now you have Latinos and Hispanics, and currently, in the current US Census, people get to choose. You know, there's been a big issue in Texas where some Hispanics are termed by the census taker as white, sometimes Hispanic, sometimes Latino. But if there's any improvement at all, which in many ways there's not, it simply means that, the improvement is that people get to choose on their own. They get to identify themselves. So I've already mentioned Latino, and I just wanted to show you very quickly some of you have seen these pictures before in my class. This has always been curious to me, as I say, how people identify themselves. So I've asked some of these people at least. So in the upper left, you have a young lady. Her mother is Spanish, born and raised in Zaragoza, España. So the young lady, her first language was Spanish. Her father is Anglo, Scottish, Irish. And I'm just asking you all, given that her mother's Spanish, would you consider her Hispanic? Okay, so I asked her and said, in so many words, do you consider yourself Hispanic? And she said, no. And part of me goes, well, yes, you are, because that's by definition what it is. But she said no, and I can't say, oh, no, you're wrong. So that's how she identifies herself. That is my niece. So on the, on the lower left is mi yerno, my son-in-law. So his name is Ezekiel. He's from Argentina. So I asked him, do you consider yourself Hispanic? And he said, no, not Hispanic, but Latino, yes. I go, well, how do you see the difference? He said, I don't know, I'm just Latino. I said, okay, that's how you identify yourself, I'm fine with that. Now, some other people who may not consider them as Mexicans, and that's what I want to focus on, is what exactly is a Mexican. So that dashingly handsome man in the upper right is my great-grandfather. So he was born in Illinois, but moved to Mexico in the late 19th century because at that, just ask you, would a guy born in the United States, he's, like me, puro güero, would he be a Mexican in your mind? So I'm seeing some yeses, some no's. I mean, he considered himself a Mexican, but not everyone else did. Very similarly, the gentleman on the lower right, those are Mitt Romney's, I think, like fourth cousins. In case you were not aware, the Romney family has been in northern Mexico for decades. Some of you may know that George Romney was a presidential candidate in 1968. He ran knowing full well that he could not become president because he was not born in the United States. He was born in Mexico. I said, but his descendants and their relatives, the Romneys, still live in Mexico. So they've been there 5 generations now. Would you consider them Mexicans? Okay, some say yes, and see if a few no. So they consider themselves. So then the next screen here, a little bit more of the same there. So the gentleman on the left is Lázaro Cárdenas. So without doubt, kind of the prototypical Mexican president, very popular. And when I say prototypical, he had indigenous roots as well as Spanish roots. So I say just kind of that prototypical, once again, very popular. No question, he's a Mexican. He's Hispanic, he's Latino, he's all of the above. Okay, so to the upper right, you have Los Menonitas, or Mennonites. So originally they came from Holland, correct? The Netherlands. Okay, so present-day Holland, so they would come to the United States, and remember there's a colony up in Seminole, Texas, to the north of us. There's a huge colony of Mennonites in Cuauhtemoc to the south of Ciudad Chihuahua. So as I say, they've been there for generations. They speak Spanish, but they also speak Plattdeutsch, an old Tarahumara Indians. So those are indigenous people. Many of them do not speak Spanish. I remember just very quickly on a trip up there, I talked to a little girl and I just said, ¿Cómo estás? And she just stared at me. So like a good American, I said it louder and slower. ¿Cómo estás? And she just still stared at me. And one of the teachers said, well, she doesn't speak Spanish. And, oh, I thought all Mexicans spoke Spanish. Well, they don't. All right, so as I say, are they Mexican? Yes. Are they Hispanic? All right, there's no traces to, if you will, the old world. Latino. I mean, I don't know. I've never asked them, because I don't speak that language. So I don't know the answer to that. Okay, then a little bit more directly about Mexican-American identity. And this is, as I say, as a political scientist looking at this, it's a very interesting thing. So in the 1930s, believe it or not, California, that was not the only state, but California began to create separate schools for Mexicans and whites. So this was done at the behest of white parents. Now here's the problem. How do you go out there and label all the Mexicans? Is it how they look, how they sound, what they speak? Because they didn't have to self-identify, it was others labeling them as Mexicans. So if you look Mexican, which I don't know what that means, as I think I've just shown you, one doesn't really look Mexican. It's not an ethnicity, it's a nationality. So that would be allowed in the 1930s, and you'll see that would be overchanged here in just a little bit. But along with that, in the 1930s, there was a superintendent in Southern California, James Kent. I don't remember what school district, and it doesn't matter, but he would say people of Mexican descent are intellectually, culturally, and morally inferior to European Americans. So that was if you will, the legal basis for having separate schools. And then I'll come back to that point in just a minute. But as part of this animosity, and Dr. Van Delden and I had a previous discussion about this, would be the Sleepy Lagoon. I mean, I won't get into that, will you? A little bit, so leave that to him. But the Zoot Suit riots, you'll see that they would start in May of 1943, but I'd say they'd take full swing, if you will, in June of 1943. And what had happened is, these took place in Los Angeles, and you had these youth, Mexican-American youth, who would dress up in the Zoot Suits. Okay, so that picture on the right, that was my first exposure to ever hearing the term Pachuco and Zoot Suit. was there was a play in the 1970s in Los Angeles where it began, and I say I grew up in Los Angeles, as I mentioned before, and that is a very young Edward James Olmos, if you're familiar with that actor. So that was one of his first major plays where he would put on the zoot suit and play the part of the Pachuco. Right, so the people who wore the zoot suits, they say, were Mexican-American youth, and this is right during the heart of World War II. There was a lot of fear of outsiders. Remember, the Japanese had already been interned in essentially concentration camps all along the West Coast. You know, Manzanar out by Bishop, California, and so forth was one of the larger ones. I went to junior high with a lot of kids whose parents had been imprisoned in Manzanar. So at any rate, there's this hostility to the outsider. So these Mexican Americans who were dressing differently, sounded differently, and by golly, looked differently, were fodder for this hatred, if you will. So these race riots, you see there, the servicemen targeted Pachuco youth, arguing they were un-American. You know, they're not dressing like us, and they're not in the war. Well, no one bothered to ask them, how old are you guys? Most of them were 16 and 17, right? So they were too young to fight, so you've got that. So underage youth, too young to be drafted. So during the riots, they would be physically beaten, stripped of their zoot suits, and the clothing would be destroyed. Many of them had the ducktail haircuts. Their hair would be cut off in the back. All the while the LAPD, always known for its equanimity and quality, would just look aside. You know, I mean, just totally ignored what went on. So lastly there, you see Mendez versus Westminster, where a few things about him by way of introduction. So Martin obtained his PhD in comparative literature from Columbia University in 1990. So prior to joining the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at UCLA, where he currently works and serves as a department chair, he taught at New York University, Rice, and University of Southern California. So he's the author of several books, several articles, even obviously much more articles. Among his books are Carlos Fuentes, Mexico and Modernity, published by Vanderbilt University Press in 1989, which was, by the way, recognized as an outstanding scholarly book by Choice magazine. He is co-author with Yvonne Grenier of Gunshots at the Fiesta, Literature and Politics in Latin America, published by Vanderbilt University in 2009. And lastly there, he's still working on other books. He's currently translating his own book from English to Spanish. But in 2021, or last year, he published Reality and Movement, Octavio Paz as Essayist and Public Intellectual, published by Vanderbilt University. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Professor Martin van Delden.
Good evening, buenas noches. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. I want to begin by thanking the University of Texas Permian Basin, obviously, for the invitation to speak here this evening. And I also had the opportunity to give a writing workshop yesterday, which was very interesting and enjoyable. I also want to thank the Odessa Council for the Arts and Humanities and the Latin American Writer Series. And finally, I want to thank La Nena, who is a locutora at the Spanish language radio station here in Odessa, that is Q108 FM. I don't know if you listen to Q108 FM, but I had the opportunity to be interviewed briefly by her to announce this speech. And last but not least, I want to thank Professor Antonio Moreno here of UTPB, who has been a wonderful host, anfitrion, since Sunday evening, showing me around. We've been talking nonstop about literary, cultural, and political topics, and we haven't disagreed about anything until about half an hour ago when we found something that we disagreed about, but we'll be discussing that further after the talk this evening. And thank you also to Dr. Perry for the kind introduction and for showing that the question of identity is very complicated. So I'm going to be talking this evening about Octavio Paz, and I'm actually going to be zeroing in on just 5 pages from his best-known work, which is El Laberinto de la Soledad, The Labyrinth of Solitude. I have my copy here. 5 pages that actually deal with the figure of the Pachuco. But since I'm not assuming that all of you have a detailed knowledge of Octavio Paz's writing career or know exactly how to situate him in historical context, I'm going to begin with a little bit of background. I'm going to talk about Paz's life and what led up to him writing El Laberinto de la Soledad, give a little bit of context, and then I'm going to talk also about the reception of El Laberinto de la Soledad, how it was the critical commentary. My reading of the passages that I'm going to be discussing is a little different from that of most critics. So I have a minority viewpoint here, and I'm going to try to explain my viewpoint, and I hope I can make it convincing. And then at the end, I'm also going to try to situate him once again in a broader context. So as you can see here, Paz was born in 1914, the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution started in 1910, and it didn't end until the end of the decade. So when Paz was born, the revolution was raging around the country. He came from a distinguished family, a family that economically had fallen on hard times at this point. So he was not raised in wealthy circumstances by any means, but his grandfather, who was most responsible for raising him, and I'll explain why in a moment, his grandfather was a well-known author, politician, and also owned a newspaper in Mexico City. And his father, with whom he is pictured here, so this is young Octavio at maybe age 4 or 5 with his parents. And his father was a lawyer and also a writer. He wrote some works of history. Octavio Paz's paternal family came from the state of Jalisco, and his mother had immigrated from Andalusia in Spain. So she was from Spain, so he had kind of a mixed Mexican-Spanish heritage. Paz started, what I wanted to mention about his father is actually a very interesting detail. I mentioned that he was a lawyer. During the Mexican Revolution, he joined the Zapatistas. So there were different factions, as I'm sure you know, during the Mexican Revolution, and one of the most well-known factions was led by Emiliano Zapata. They were based towards the south of Mexico City in the state of Morelos. So Octavio Paz's father joined the Zapatistas, and later he was actually sent by Emiliano Zapata to Los Angeles to serve as his representative there. And young Octavio also moved with his mother to Los Angeles and lived there for 2 years. And he actually has some very interesting, I would even say moving reflections on that period in his life. He was between the ages of 4 and 6, so they're probably his earliest memories. But in a text, a work that he wrote late in his life in the 1990s, just a few years before passing away during his life in intellectual and also personal terms, he devotes a few pages to recounting his memories of attending school in Los Angeles and the hostility that he received from his Anglo classmates when instead of saying spoon, he said cuchara. So he has some early memories of living in the United States. His family returned to Mexico in 1920. His father was actually an alcoholic and did not spend very much time at home, did devote a lot of time to his political career, but apparently spent a lot of time drinking as well, and ended up dying in a train accident where it was rumored that he had committed suicide, but it's probably more likely that he was very, very drunk and was run over by a train. And this also explains why Octavio Paz was raised primarily by his grandfather, because his father was basically an absent figure in his life. Paz started his literary career very early. He published his first book of poetry at the age of 17 in 1931, so that's quite a feat. In the 1930s, he started to establish himself primarily as a poet, although he was also writing essays, but primarily as a poet. And he sort of found himself caught between two different factions within the Mexican literary world. One faction that was devoted to writing politically committed poetry, and another faction or group, is probably a better term, that believed in writing pure poetry. And what they meant by that was poetry that was not contaminated by political themes or concerns. And Paz occupied an interesting position in between those two currents. He wrote some committed poetry, but he was also very close to the contemporáneos. That was the name of this group of poets that was more interested in questions of literary form and thought that poetry should remain far from politics. In 1935, he met Elena Garro, who later became a prominent writer in Mexico herself. In fact, she wrote some extraordinary novels, principal being Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, a novel from 1963. But at the time, he met her in 1935. They got married a couple of years later, had a very stormy and turbulent relationship. They traveled to Spain in 1937. As you may know, there was a civil war raging in Spain at the time that had started in 1936 with an uprising on the part of the Spanish military headed by General Francisco Franco. And intellectuals worldwide who were opposed to Franco and his attempt to establish a fascist dictatorship in Spain, an attempt that was ended up being successful, intellectuals organized a series of conferences in order to express and show their opposition to the rise of fascism. It wasn't only in Spain, of course, that fascism was on the rise in these years. And Octavio Paz, even though he was still a very young poet, 23 years old, he'd already published a couple of books. He caught the attention of some of the organizers of a congress of intellectuals that was going to be held in Valencia, a city in Spain. Specifically, he caught the attention of Pablo Neruda, who was somewhat older, already more established, and was working for the Chilean consular service. So both Neruda and Paz ended up winning the Nobel Prize. So Paz had caught Neruda's attention for his work, and Neruda extended an invitation or urged the organizers of the Congress in Valencia to extend an invitation to Paz. And Paz traveled to Spain. Here's a photograph of him with Elena Garro in Barcelona in 1937, met a lot of intellectuals, familiarized himself with the battles going on, not only between, let's say, leftist or pro-Republican, that is the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, intellectuals, but also the battles within the left itself. So there were very complicated situations that he was an observer of during that period. After the visit to Spain, which lasted several months, he returned to Mexico, wrote poetry and essays, participated in various important literary ventures, such as establishing magazines, putting together anthologies. During this period, he also became embroiled in various cultural and political battles, including an especially acrimonious conflict with his former friend, Pablo Neruda, who was also living in Mexico during these years because he had been appointed to work in the Chilean embassy in Mexico. So he was working there and also interacting with a lot of the Mexican poets. And also a lot of poets had come from Spain after the end of the Civil War, which ended with the defeat of the Republican side, that is the side that was defending democracy in Spain, and they were forced into exile, and many of them, many intellectuals, poets, and academics went to Mexico. So it was a very lively cultural scene. But Pablo Neruda was sympathetic to the Soviet Union and to communism. Octavio Paz was on the left in the 1930s, but he never joined the Communist Party. He always kept the communists a little bit at arm's length. And when Stalin signed a a pact with Adolf Hitler just before the start of the Second World War, Paz became even more kind of suspicious of Stalin and the Soviet Union and the communist regime. And this distance that he established between himself and Soviet communism led to a conflict with Pablo Neruda, who was more pro-Soviet. And apparently they even ended up getting into a physical fight with each other at a reception in Mexico City in 1943. Octavio Paz would always call Pablo Neruda, whose poetry he greatly admired, even if not his politics, he would always call him mi enemigo más querido, that is, my most beloved enemy, or the enemy who I love the most, or something like that. So in 1943, Paz received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and this photograph is from the 1940s. I'm actually not sure where it was taken, whether it was in Mexico City or in California. Maybe if somebody can identify the vegetation and locate the photograph, that would be much appreciated, but I know that it's from the 1940s. So in 1943, this is the next stage of my account of Paz's life. 1943, he receives a Guggenheim Fellowship to study or to write a book on La Expresión Poética Americana, that is, American poetic expression. This was going to be a book that would look at both American, that is, US American poets and Latin American poets. He wanted to adopt a continental approach to the topic. Unfortunately, he never wrote the book. Apparently, he did feel very bad about that because the Guggenheim Foundation paid him a monthly salary for for at least a year, but he wrote many other books, so I don't think that there was any need for him to feel bad. But the Guggenheim Fellowship gave him the opportunity to travel to the United States. Specifically, he settled in the Bay Area and lived in San Francisco and Oakland. He arrived there in November of 1943, passed through Los Angeles first, and then went to the Bay Area, where he lived for approximately 2 years, attending classes at the University of California, Berkeley, making friends in American poetic circles. So he met a lot of poets who lived in the area, primary among them Muriel Rukeyser, who ended up also translating his work into English, and he also worked for a time in the Mexican consulate. So now I'm going to say a few words. Dr. Perry already touched on this topic, but I'm going to say a few words about LA in the 1940s, because this is background to the first chapter of El Laberinto de la Soledad, the Labyrinth of Solitude, so the work that I'm going to be analyzing in a moment. Dr. Perry already mentioned the Pachucos. It was a Mexican-American youth subculture of the period that apparently originated in the El Paso area, and families migrated to California. It was characterized by a specific style of dress, as we can see here, the zoot suit with baggy pants, jackets with very wide lapels, the watch chain, the shirt with also the very wide collars. And this was considered at the time by majority society as constituting a gesture of rebelliousness or challenge, or it was considered even to be somewhat offensive. And this is what led to the Zoot Suit riots, which Dr. Perry also mentioned. American servicemen who were stationed in Los Angeles were in the middle of World War II, began to randomly attack young Mexican Americans in the streets of Los Angeles who were outfitted in these zoot suits. Now, a little bit of background is the Sleepy Lagoon case, which Dr. Perry also mentioned, which involved the murder of a young Mexican American in Los Angeles. This had occurred the year before, in August of 1942. The body of a young Mexican American had been found in an area of Los Angeles known as Sleepy Lagoon. The police subsequently, like a week later, arrested a large number of Mexican American youth and put them on trial, and eventually Quite a few of them, not all of them, but quite a few of them were found guilty and sentenced to long prison terms, although it was clear that there wasn't very much evidence that these were false accusations. In fact, upon appeal, they were all released. But this clearly also caused a lot of unrest in the community and is the background to the Zoot Suit riots. And here we have another image from those days, and you can see how these young men have had their pants slashed. So that's what the servicemen, Marines, sailors who were stationed in the Los Angeles harbor, they went into the street with knives and started attacking the Pachucos and ripping their clothes, because what their argument was that wearing these kinds of clothes was wasteful because it used a lot of cloth. And supposedly we were during wartime, so there were shortages. So this was the pretext that they used in order to attack them. So here you see two of their victims with their trousers slashed. And then here's another picture where you see these men in their uniforms holding up the pieces of cloth to show, almost as trophies to justify their acts of aggression. The riots lasted several days until the police finally intervened, after having just sort of stood by and not done anything for a period of time. So obviously Octavio Paz he never refers to the Sleepy Lagoon case. He doesn't refer to the Zoot Suit riots in his work, but clearly this is the background to his approach to the Pachuco in The Labyrinth of Solitude. So let me say a few things about The Labyrinth of Solitude as a work overall before I zero in on his description of the figure of the Pachuco. In a 1990 interview at the 92nd Street Y in New York, shortly after receiving the Nobel Prize, an interview with Barnard College professor Alfred McAdam, Paz mentioned that in the 1940s he had been working on a novel that he described as Laurentian, referring to the British novelist D.H. Lawrence, who had actually visited Mexico and wrote a very powerful book about Mexico titled The Plumed Serpent. So Paz had been influenced by this British author writing about Mexico, and in this interview he says, I was writing a Laurentian novel about the Mexican character during these years in the 1940s, so where he was living in California previously. It wasn't entirely clear when he had started writing the novel, but during the 1940s. The novel was never completed, it was never published, but instead of the novel he wrote The Labyrinth of Solitude. So even though this novel, nobody has ever seen this novel, I have a very strong feeling that the ideas and themes that he was reflecting on in this narrative work that never got finished, that he channeled them into this essayistic work. The Labyrinth of Solitude, it's a long essay about the Mexican character, about Mexican culture, and about Mexican history, and in the end, in the final chapter, about the human condition as a whole as well. He wrote this book in Paris, so after spending 2 years in California, he received a position in the Mexican diplomatic service, and he was assigned to the Mexican embassy in Paris. And just after the end of World War II, he moved to Paris. And this is where he wrote The Labyrinth of Solitude, a book which appeared in its first edition in 1950, and then he continued to revise it, he expanded it, and published a second edition in 1959. But fundamentally, the bulk of it was written in Paris in the late 1940s. And the first chapter, and that's the section of the book that I'm going to focus on, the first chapter actually starts in California. He starts by talking about his experiences when he arrives in California, his initial impressions, and specifically he mentions the fact that when he came to California, he was confronted with a sense of his own identity. So it was the encounter with a society and a culture that was so different from his own that made him more aware of his identity as a Mexican. And in the course of this meditation, he switches to the topic of the Pachuco. So he devotes about 4 or 5 pages to the figure of the Pachuco, and then moves on again to a more general reflection about Mexican identity. So the pages about the Pachuco have actually caused a lot of controversy among critics in Mexico and elsewhere who have read and studied this work. And let's say the majority view among the critics is that Paz's attitude towards the Pachuco is a derogatory one, that it's a negative portrait of the Pachuco, that he adopts an attitude of disdain towards the Pachuco, that he has a kind of contempt for him. And my argument is going to be that no, in fact, Octavio Paz sympathized with the Pachuco, and I'm going to try to present some evidence for that. Not only evidence from letters that he wrote in the period, but also from the text itself. If you look at the portrait of the Pachuco in its context, the larger context of the work as a whole, and I'll also say a few things about the cultural currents of the period, it becomes clear that, that this is a much more complicated portrait than might appear at first. So here's a picture of the cover of El Laberinto de la Soledad, first published in 1950. Oh, wait a minute. Oh dear. There's some slides missing here. Let's see. I don't know what happened, but a couple of slides. Okay, well, I can manage. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show the, I think I won't be able to put up the quotations here from El Laberinto de la Soledad that I was going to focus on, but I largely remember them, so I can manage even without the slide. I'm not sure what went wrong with my PowerPoint. I may have attached an earlier version rather than the latest version. Anyway, the Pachuco, the portrait of the Pachuco occupies about 5 pages in El Laberinto de la Soledad. As I mentioned, many critics think that this is a derogatory portrait of the Pachuco, and it is clear that there are elements in the portrait that can certainly be taken to be quite negative. For example, he says at one point that the Pachuco is un clown impasible y siniestro, that is, an impassive and sinister clown. So there, obviously, that's not a very positive approach. But he also, mentions other aspects of the Pachuco's identity. For example, he talks about the Pachuco as someone who is struggling with his identity. He says the Pachuco is someone for whom his Mexican identity is un problema de verdad vital, un problema de vida o muerte, a truly vital problem, a problem of life and death. So he gives the Pachuco a kind of dramatic quality as someone who is struggling with the question of identity. He also talks about the Pachuco as being characterized by kind of an instinctive rebelliousness. And my view is that this is actually, for Paz, this is something positive. He regards the figure of the rebel as a positive figure. And also throughout Paz's work, the notion of that which is instinctive or spontaneous always has like a positive connotation. So when he talks about the Pachuco as being an instinctive rebel, I have the feeling that he's actually sympathizing with him. He also talks about the Pachuco as being torn from his roots, right? That he's separated from his Mexican roots, from which he has been distanced, and at the same time as someone who has not integrated, cannot integrate into American society. So he's living in a kind of in-between state. Paz talks about him living a la intemperie, which basically means a kind of unsheltered existence. Other terms that he uses to describe the Pachuco, he talks about his singularidad. He uses that word over and over again, his singularity, which is a way of saying that he's separate, he's kind of a solitary figure, he stands apart from everyone else. And again, I think that this points to a dimension of the Pachuco that Paz finds compelling, and as I mentioned earlier, that Paz actually identifies with. So in order to demonstrate this idea, to provide some evidence for the idea that Paz actually identified with the Pachuco, I'm going to present a few excerpts from letters that Octavio Paz wrote to his wife, Elena Garro. So she had initially accompanied him with their daughter. They had a 4 or 5 year old daughter when they arrived in California. Elena Garro initially accompanied him to Berkeley, stayed with him for approximately a year, but then they were struggling to make ends meet, and they decided that Elena should go back with their daughter because in Mexico City she'd be able to find some employment. They had also been joined by Elena's sister, Estrella, who while in California contracted tuberculosis and had to be interned in a sanatorium. So Elena goes back to Mexico City. Octavio stays in Berkeley, then moves to San Francisco. He's working in the Mexican consulate, and he's also constantly making trips to visit Estrella, his sister-in-law, who spends 4 or 5 months in a sanatorium somewhere. I don't remember in which San Francisco suburb. Maybe it was Richmond. So these letters that Octavio Paz wrote to Elena Garro, the originals are actually in the Princeton University Library. Elena Garro donated all of her papers and manuscripts, including letters from Octavio Paz, to the Princeton University Library. That's an incredible resource. Most of the letters are from the earlier period of their relationship, the 1935 to 1937, and then there's a break after they get married. Obviously, they don't have to write to each other as much. And then they resume in 1944 when they separate, and Paz is living in Berkeley, San Francisco, and Elena is back in Mexico City. The letters are mostly devoted to questions of money. He was struggling with his finances, and he's constantly trying to add up, like, okay, I'm going to get this much from the consulate, and I'm going to get this much from the Guggenheim Foundation, and maybe I can make ends meet. But the passages that I wanted to focus on are the ones that I've put up here on the screen, and maybe I should put it. And that they, these passages, they provide evidence for my claim that Octavio Paz actually identified with the Pachucos. The first passage, and I've put it up in Spanish as well as an English translation by myself, describes, it's a very long letter. He was a giant of the epistolary genre. He loved to write letters. This is a very long letter, 6 or 7 pages. And towards the end, he describes how he goes and visits Estrella at the sanatorium. And when he comes back, it's getting dark. He's riding a bus, and he says, he describes his experience on the bus as follows. He says, "Suddenly I arrived in San Francisco and I realized how lonely I felt, and that truly all the other passengers on the bus were like dead people to me, because I couldn't talk to anyone, or better said, that I was like a dead person to everyone because no one knew me. No one even knew that I existed. No one was waiting for me, and there was no one to whom I could describe the hallucinations I was suffering on a solitary bus on a foggy evening." So in other words, his experience as a Mexican living alone in the Bay Area was one of solitude. And this passage really sums up that sensation that no one knows him, that he's not going back home to anyone who will greet him. No one even knows that he exists. And it's really the depiction of a sense of a loss of identity. So I think he's describing exactly the same thing when he's talking about the Pachucos living a la intemperie without any kind of shelter, right? You know, engaging in this rebellion, trying to express themselves, but being constantly frustrated in that effort. In another letter from the 24th of October 1944, that's the next passage, I have it up first in Spanish and then in English, he says, "At least in Mexico people understand me. I have a longing to be a person, not a cipher or some strange being." But once again you see here the experience of a loss of identity, of being a stranger, an outsider to this society, and that's exactly the way in which he describes the Pachucos. And I should mention that later in his life, when he became very, very famous, Paz was often gave interviews to journalists in Mexico, but also in other countries. And he wrote many essays about, I mentioned the semi-autobiography, Itinerario, that he wrote in the 1990s, but he also wrote other essays that were kind of personal reflections. He went back to reflect on the Labyrinth of Solitude on several different occasions. In other words, he wrote different texts that are kind of recapitulations of the themes of the Labyrinth of Solitude, or where he goes back to the Labyrinth of Solitude and tries to explain what he was doing, or tries to elaborate on some of the ideas, or update them. And on many occasions he actually said explicitly, he talks about his arrival in California, and he says explicitly, when I arrived in California, I encountered the Pachucos y me identificaba con ellos. And some critics have treated this with some skepticism and have said, well, the text doesn't really back this up. You know, we feel that his attitude is a little hostile and disdainful, and they argue that, well, 30 years have passed and Paz simply thinks that he identifies with the Pachucos. But I actually think that these letters, which, by the way, were just published a few months ago. These letters were in the Princeton archives, but they were just published in book form a few months ago, edited by a very eminent Paz critic, Guillermo Sheridan from Mexico. So, you know, these materials weren't accessible yet for earlier critics. So to go back to the quotations here, I'm arguing that his own sense of alienation, of estrangement, of a struggle with his identity, of his view of his identity as a problem, as a kind of question, these are all elements in his letters that demonstrate that, as I'm arguing, that he actually felt very close in his experience to the Pachucos. And the last quotation that I have here, the context is he's writing a letter again to Elena Garro, and he's talking about his experiences working in the Mexican consulate, and he's complaining about the work in the Mexican consulate. He says that they all treat him badly. He says, they treat me like an office boy. I guess his rank was, he was like at the lowest level in the Mexican embassy, and he also complained that all of the other people working in the Mexican consulate, of course, in San Francisco, not embassy, that they didn't really care about their work, that they were kind of indifferent. And he says, I always stay late, you know, I really want to do a good job. And then, and this is the passage that I quote, he explains why he's so committed to his work in the Mexican consulate. And he says, and I'm going to read it in Spanish because I think it's very powerful in Spanish. Me da pena ver a los pobres braceros literalmente desamparados. And in the letter, these words are in capitals. So he puts it literalmente desamparados in capital letters. Y el increíble descuido con que esta gente mira los problemas de los braceros y de los residentes mexicanos. So it makes me sad to see the poor braceros truly abandoned, or literally defenseless maybe would be a better translation, and the incredible indifference with which these people view the problems of the braceros and the Mexicans who reside here. And these people are his colleagues in the Mexican consulate, like the people who are higher up and, you know, who should be doing most of this work. According to Paz, they view the braceros who are Mexican. You know about the Bracero program of 1942, which was an agreement between Mexico and the United States to allow Mexican workers to come to the United States to work here for several months on temporary contracts. And Paz is saying that the other members of the Mexican consulate really don't care, And he's clearly expressing a sense of, again, a sense of solidarity, a preoccupation, and this comes up in other letters as well. Now, of course, the braceros aren't the same as the Pachucos, right? He's talking about the exact same group within the Mexican-American community. But I think what the letter expresses is a general sense of solidarity with Mexicans in the United States, and that would argue for his sense of identification, or at least empathy towards the Pachuco. So I'm going to say a few more words about the structure of the book to back up my argument about Paz's approach to the Pachuco, because I think that if you just focus on the passages themselves, you can pick out a lot of negative sounding words. But if you locate the description of the Pachuco within the larger conception of the work, then you can see that the Pachuco is actually connected to other figures that he discusses and other figures that have a key role to play within the conception of the work. And so what other figures am I talking about? In the opening paragraph, Octavio Paz evokes the figure of an adolescent. And the opening sentence of the first chapter of El laberinto de la soledad actually runs as follows. A todos en algún momento se nos ha revelado nuestra existencia como algo particular, intransferible y precioso. That is, to all of us at some point in time have experienced our existence as something particular, or maybe special, untransferable, in other words, something that you can't share with others, and precious. And then he goes on to say that this revelation of the uniqueness of our existence usually takes place during the period of adolescence. So he starts by evoking the figure of the adolescent. Then later in the same paragraph, there's another very striking image. He says the adolescent is surprised by his or her own existence. Se asombra de ser. He is amazed. It really would be a better translation. And to that surprise follows reflection. And then he goes on, and I quote from the passage, inclinado sobre el río de su conciencia, se pregunta si ese rostro que aflora lentamente del fondo, deformado por el agua, es el suyo. So he's leaning over the river of his own consciousness and asks himself whether that face that he sees rising up from the depths of the water is his own. So it's the idea of his identity as being a problem, a question. It's not certain, right? There's an uncertainty about his own identity. So that's the opening passage, the first paragraph, where you have the image of the adolescent seeking his own identity. Then a few pages on, we have this passage where Paz talks about his experience when he arrives in California. And I already referred to this briefly before. And interestingly enough, he uses the same verb. He says, inclinado sobre la vida norteamericana. So I leaned over American life, just as the adolescent was leaning over the river of his own consciousness, or leaning forward, contemplating the river of his own consciousness. The verb in Spanish is inclinar. Maybe you could say in English inclined, but I don't think that's quite right. It's more like leaning over. But by using the same verb to describe his own experience in the encounter with the United States, which for him represents the other, by using the same verb, inclinar sobre el río de la vida norteamericana, he's connecting himself with the adolescent. So he's saying, I'm like the adolescent. What's the similarity? Well, we're both searching for our identity. And then a few pages on, he gets to the Pachuco. And it's clear that it's a series of parallels that he's establishing between the adolescent in the first paragraph, then Paz himself a few pages on, and then the Pachuco, who also becomes the figure, or becomes yet another figure of the individual searching for their identity, of the individual who is uncertain of their identity and is seeking to establish what it might be, is questioning, is seeking. So I think that if you put the description of the Pachuco in its context, you can see that this is not, clearly Paz is not writing against the adolescent or against himself or against the Mexican people as a whole, because after the Pachuco, his emphasis shifts to generalizing about Mexican culture and the Mexican character, and the Pachuco is his way into this topic. The Pachuco, in a way, is also the paradigmatic Mexican. He himself says, the title of the first chapter is El Pachuco y otros extremos, the Pachuco and other extremes. And at the end of his chapter he says, the Pachuco is one of the extremes that can be reached by the Mexicans. In other words, the Pachucos are kind of an extreme version of the dilemmas faced by Mexicans themselves. And for Paz, I mean, here I have to summarize very, very quickly because I'm reaching the end of my presentation. For Paz, the fundamental dilemma of the Mexican is the problem of solitude, is the problem of not having been able to reconcile themselves with their origin. So he has a whole historical exploration as to why solitude is such a fundamental experience for the Mexican. But again, the Pachuco is his point of entry into that experience of solitude. And then at the end, we have to remember that he's writing this book in Paris in the late 1940s. At the end of the book, he establishes a connection with a kind of universal experience of solitude. He ends up saying, well, we are all human beings everywhere are confronting the experience of solitude. And I mentioned Paris in the late 1940s because the most influential philosophical current at this time is existentialism. And what was one of the main themes of existentialism, or the main theme of existentialist philosophy in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus? It was solitude. And so there's an intersection then between Paz's meditation on Mexican identity and the themes that he sees being explored in the Parisian intellectual world in this period. And that allows him to then state, well, this solitude that we as Mexicans experience is also that all humans experience. Some critics have attacked him for that because they feel that by turning it into a universal human condition, he sort of deprives it of its specific Mexicanness, and that he depoliticizes the topic. But he's also trying to, I think that he's trying to establish a connection between Mexican history and Mexican experience and the experience of people elsewhere. And he's also trying to sort of, by making it universal, he's also trying to elevate that Mexican experience and saying, no, this is a particularly intense version of a universal condition rather than being something eccentric or outside of the mainstream. So I mentioned in closing, I'm sorry that I lost a couple of slides because my last slide was actually a still from a famous movie from the 1950s, Rebel Without a Cause. Because my other argument is that I just said an important philosophical theme in the late 1940s was solitude. Another important figure in literature and philosophy and film of the period was the figure of the rebel. This is reflected in, I just mentioned Albert Camus, a French existentialist writer. He published a really important book in 1950 and 1951 called L'Homme Révolté, translated into into English as The Rebel. And it's all about the importance of rebellion in the modern world. He's basically saying, rebellion is fundamental for us to be free, to establish our identity, to resist oppression. And Paz actually met Camus in Paris in the late 1940s, and they became friends. There's another book from the period that was, to the best of my recollection, it was a bestseller by a British author named Colin Wilson, The Outsider. And that also tackles this same issue and kind of celebrates the figure of the outsider. Of course, the 1950s are known as a decade of conformism, right? And of of conservatism, but I think precisely that explains why the figure of the rebel became so important in those years. It's also reflected in the Beat movement in the United States. So my argument is that Octavio Paz, in writing The Labyrinth of Solitude, in zeroing in on the figure of the Pachuco, that in some ways he's participating in, or maybe even anticipating, this international cultural current of celebration of the figure of the rebel. So in summary, yes, there are some negative elements in his portrayal, but I think that ultimately Paz sees the Pachuco as a positive figure representing the forces of rebellion, which he himself also sympathized with during this period of his career. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, and then over.
So, my degrees are in English, so I'm an outsider to this. I knew Octavio Paz as a Nobel Prize winner, but you basically told me what I know about Octavio Paz.
Okay.
But yeah, when I was listening, I noticed that you kept emphasizing, I guess it's an outsider status and what have you, and as well with Pachuco, him being in Los Angeles as a child and being picked on or mocked because of the way he talks.
Yeah.
I guess his kind of sort of liminal status between the pure poetry and political poetry, his alienation from Neruda and the other sort of Mexican intellectuals and artists and what have you. And so I mean, it kind of reminded me of Bob Dylan, where he's an outsider to whatever side there was. Okay, and I noticed that what's that fourth bullet on that, you said at least in Mexico. What was it? At least in Mexico.
People know me or something like that. People understand me. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I mean, I don't know if that at least is like maybe a superposition of English over the Mexican that isn't there. But in Mexico, was he just as alienated as he was in all these other situations? Because you kept describing being in foreign countries and always an outsider if you're in a foreign country. But was that same alienation outsiderdom in Mexico as well as all these other experiences that you emphasize? And how does that relate to this kind of the lens through which he used Pachuco?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. Thank you for summarizing my talk so well, and thank you for the excellent question. It's not an easy question to answer. I would say yes and no. So the question is, was he also an outsider in Mexico? I would say yes and no. First of all, the no part is, and this is, a lot of critics question him for adopting the pose of or they say it's a pose, that he's an outsider and a solitary figure and that he feels estranged from the world and so on and so forth, because they point to the fact that he was an incredibly successful author in Mexico and internationally, and played a very central role in the intellectual and cultural life of his country. So they'll say, no, Octavio Paz is an establishment figure. How can you talk about being an outsider to your own country? And I think there's some truth to that. But at the same time, so that's the no part. No, he wasn't an outsider in his own country. And towards the end of his life, I mean, he was like, the most celebrated author, and was actually very close to the government and to the president of Mexico in the late 80s and early 1990s. So you could easily question that, and people have done that. But I would say at the same time, yes, he was still an outsider, because he never really fit really comfortably within the Mexican literary world. He was constantly attacked. He was very controversial, even from the early period of his career, for different reasons. There were political reasons for it, because he distanced himself from the left. I mean, he considered himself a socialist until the 1990s. He would still say, no, I'm a socialist or a social democrat. If I were French, I would vote for François Mitterrand. If I were Spanish, I would vote for Felipe González. So they're the left-wing candidates. So he always identified himself as a person affiliated with the left, but at a time when, in decades when the left was really dominant in the Mexican literary and cultural world, He was very critical also. He was critical of the Soviet Union. He was critical of totalitarian tendencies within communist ideology. And that made him the object of a lot of criticism. And in terms of his writing, I also already commented on his slightly uncomfortable position with regard to the predominant currents in the Mexican poetic world. So I think the fact that he was the object of so much criticism, that he was so controversial, would allow you to state, well, in some ways, maybe that sense of alienation and estrangement from the surrounding world also followed him in Mexico. But I think it's a great question, and I would say, well, yes and no. Yes?
I have this, on that issue of the criticism toward Paz, particularly this book, I feel the preface to the question is I lived in Mexico City for 15 years, starting in 1997. So I've heard a lot of anti-Paz discussions. And then some of them seem to me like cheap shots at the guy at top. But among the criticisms of Paz, I want your opinion about the notion that the Labyrinths of Solitude speaks to a certain class of Mexico, an upper class, and leaves behind the Sabinus crowd or the Oscar Viva crowd, the Chapaneros, and so on. I don't think it does, but I'd like your opinion.
Yeah, well, so this is another thing that, or an element of the Labyrinths of Solitude that has been heavily criticized. Critics will say, well, this work is essentialist, or it's reductive. Essentialist in the sense that it tries to fix Mexican identity and say, this is what it is. It's something unchanging. And it's reductive because it only focuses on part of the population. And I think, and I was discussing this yesterday in the writing workshop, there's always an enormous risk in writing about national identity. And I would say that in our day and age, it probably makes us uncomfortable to talk about national identity in the way people did. I mean, this work is over 70 years old. And at that time, it was a very widely practiced genre, especially in Latin America. There are many, many examples of this kind of work in Mexico and in other countries. So it was an effort that many writers devoted themselves to. But in defense, so there are definite risks of falling into stereotypes or of being reductive. But in defense of Paz, I would say, first of all, in the first chapter, there are a couple of comments that he makes addressing precisely this issue. At one point he says, well, my reflections are really just pertaining to contemporary Mexico, and it may be, I'm quoting almost literally, it may be that 50 years from now, what I'm saying here has no more relevance. Well, 70 years have passed, and we're still discussing his work, but he had the modesty, and he's not often, his modesty is not often acknowledged. He's usually presented as more of an arrogant individual, but he had the modesty to say in this book explicitly, well, maybe what I'm saying here won't be relevant anymore in 50 years. And with regard to the reductiveness or who he focuses on, he also says explicitly, I am focusing here in this work, in The Labyrinths of Solitude, on those Mexicans who have an awareness of being Mexican. So he's already reducing it and acknowledging that there are portions of the population for whom being Mexican is not an issue. I mean, you can think of indigenous peoples living in Chiapas who are not even asking themselves if they're Mexican or not. It's not a relevant question. So he's also explicitly saying, I'm looking at Mexicans who are debating the question of Mexican identity. And it probably means, although he doesn't bring up the question of class, I'm sort of assuming when I read that he's talking about middle-class Mexicans. So again, yes, it is limited, but he acknowledges it. And actually, in starting with the figure of the Pachuco, he shows that he's not just focusing on middle-class Mexicans in Mexico. He's actually going outside of Mexico, looking at los mexicanos de afuera, Mexicans who live abroad, and using, his observations of the Pachucos as a starting point for. So I think he is pretty inclusive. The Pachucos are working class. And that's where he starts. So I would say that he's more inclusive than he has been given credit for. But yes, it is always a danger in this type of writing about the national character to be stereotypical or reductive. And Paz continued to write about these topics during the rest of his career. He has many other essays tackling these topics. Essays also specifically going back to the question of the relations between Mexico and the United States. There's an essay from the 1970s, 1978, that's called México y Estados Unidos, Posiciones y Contraposiciones, where he more directly addresses, although it comes up in the Labyrinth of Solitude as well. I'm thinking about the role of indigenous cultures in his approach to Mexican identity. He does talk about the influence of indigenous cultures. In the second half of the Labyrinth of Solitude, there's a section where he talks about attitudes towards death, and he talks about the indigenous heritage, and there's a greater closeness with the reality and the experience of death than you might find in so-called modern countries like the United States, or he mentions France, where people try to, not think about death. So that connects to an analysis of the indigenous heritage. But in this essay from the 1970s, I was quoting this the other day with Antonio, he specifically says, "Los indios son el hueso de México." In other words, the indigenous peoples are like the bones of Mexico. That sounds kind of strange in English, like the skeleton of Mexico, but it's literally el hueso, son el hueso de Mexico, like it's the inner core of Mexico. So, he continued to explore this theme, and I think that he, explored it in many different ways and in a very rich way. Yes, Jaime.
I think the issue of identity is complicated because of white middle-class America. They're complicated because the term Mexican, a Mexican knows what a Mexican is, and it's an ethnic term that encompasses geography, chronology, and it's not nationalistic. It can be, it's one of many, but I think it complicates it, and it's made much more difficult than it really is. And for example, with the Pachuco and then the Bracero, those are two different groups of people. If he's in San Francisco in the 1940s dealing with Braceros, they are agricultural workers, more likely work in Northern California, and they're from Central Mexico. And there's a good chance they might be illiterate. The Pachucos in Los Angeles or in El Paso, there's a very good chance that many of them speak a broken Spanish at best. Because in the 1930s, there was the deportations of about 350,000 Mexicans were forced to go back, them and their children. California, prior to World War II and prior to the Cold War, the majority of the Mexican population is in Southern California. So the people that Paz is dealing with are Mexican, more than likely Mexican nationals who have maybe a grammar school education, and they are the most exploited part of the workforce in the American Southwest. But there's a good chance that those braceros, if they were to see Pachucos, they would look down on them porque son agringados, because they're pochos, they're Pachucos, they've lost much of their Mexican identity. And that discussion will go on without mainstream Americans even taking place. And I agree with you that Paz is very complimentary and sees them as an extension of Mexican society, which is much more diverse Mexican culture than non-Mexicans understand it, or certainly scholars. But I think he makes too many, his mistake is the generalizations. That, because the Pachucos know, and the Pachucos might make fun of, these urban Mexican Americans might make fun, tease the braceros for being Mexican, for being Mojados maybe, right? For not being American. Because the only time that Pachuco can claim to be an American is when there's an undocumented Mexican at this point. At that point is the only time that the Pachuco might have agency. Because we talk about rebels, for example, Jack Kerouac and the Beats. The Beats have tremendous agency. When they take off across the United States, they come back, they accept the sacrifices, the suffering, and they're going to enjoy the partying and everything else that goes along with it. I think the Pachucos very rarely have agency, and they know it. And so I don't think Paz understood that, at least in what he wrote in that first chapter and then the chapter on the Mexican United States. I think that he just misses that one.
Thank you for your comment. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, I made that point as well, that the Bracero and the Pachuco are different groups within the Mexican population in California. So I'm still trying to argue that the sympathy that he expresses explicitly for the Bracero, I think that would have encompassed all of the Mexican population living outside of Mexico. But you're absolutely right that he doesn't make those more subtle distinctions between, within the Mexican American population, that the experiences of the Braceros are very different from the experiences of the Pachucos, and that they might not have felt all that sympathetic towards each other. They had different experiences and different values. Yes, Paz doesn't go into that. It's very true, but I don't think that I don't think the work is set up to go into those kinds of subtleties. I'm not sure. Maybe he wasn't aware of them, but I don't think that was really he is trying to generalize, but he's trying to generalize starting from a very specific case, and the Pachucos are the specific case that he starts with. And I think he describes the experience or the condition of the Pachuco in a really vivid, and ultimately I do think it's an empathetic way. And again, yes, there are negative elements, but we also have to think of the Pachuco as representing the figure of the anti-hero. The anti-hero was a very prominent literary construct in the period, and you can't be an anti-hero if you only have positive traits, right? You have to have some negative traits, and in this case it's like when he says, oh, they're a little sinister, but even that, they're sinister because they're a little threatening, but that's just part of their character and part of their rebelliousness, which Paz ends up valuing. But yeah, thank you very much, Jaime, for those very interesting comments. Yes, Todd.
Hi, yeah. Really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. Really learned a whole lot here. Question that just popped into my mind, you were talking about how Pachuco in 1943 was contributing to this American sense of the subculture and rebelliousness that really took off, especially in the 50s with rock and roll and the beats and then onwards. And so there's been a lot done and said, of course, about how in its unacknowledged fashion, the way mainstream culture has appropriated without acknowledgement from black community, and to make rock and roll, for example, and sort of stealing, if I may, from the culture in order to create its own, rock and roll subculture. And so the question, this is all leading to a question. The question then is, do you think there is something similar going on with the Pachuco that we, by we, I mean the United States of America, owes a profound debt to the Pachuco for this idea of this culture of alienation that contributed to subculture in the 50s and beyond that people just aren't aware of?
Thank you for the question. That's a very interesting question. I had the sense that you were talking about how, and correct me if I'm wrong, how the question that you posed at the end, you mentioned the need to feel gratitude towards the figure of the Pachuco, but you also were referring to this idea that the rebellious movements of earlier periods end up kind of becoming assimilated or integrated into mainstream society, right?
Integrated, or I think that's part of my question. If you think it's been appropriated or misappropriated or possibly even stolen. I think is
yeah. Well, let me answer your question. Maybe it's in a slightly indirect way by talking a little bit about Paz and how he addressed this question of what happened to the rebellious movements as time passed. Because first of all, in the 1960s, well, he was living in India. He became Mexico's ambassador to India, and he served in India from 1962 to 1968, when he resigned after the Mexican government massacred over 300 students in Mexico City to try to suppress the student movement that had arisen that year. And Paz, in an act of real moral courage, resigned his position. But throughout the 1960s, he was very much of a 60s person. In other words, he sympathized with the counterculture. He wrote a lot about experimenting with drugs. I mean, I don't think he did a lot of drugs, but he did some drugs, and he talked about the experience of drugs and the meaning of drugs. So it was very 1960s. He talked about the civil rights movements in the United States and referred a lot to the Chicano movement, to the black struggle for civil rights, and he clearly sided. He expressed sympathy for feminism and said, feminism is really going to transform the world. But then in the 1970s and 1980s, while he continues to say, I'm a socialist and I have progressive ideals and I obviously sympathize with civil rights, he does become a little more conservative and starts to sort of question some of the consequences of the countercultural movements of the 1960s. And I'm going to explain exactly how that works by jumping to the question of the arts, because I think it's parallel to the question of social movements in some ways. So Paz was, from the beginning of his career, also a great supporter of the avant-garde in the arts. In other words, the idea that you had to continually innovate, you had to go against society, you had to question things, you had to be a rebel in the arts. But by the 1960s, he starts to question this, because he says, well, if everyone is a rebel, then no one is a rebel anymore. So it's kind of a way of talking about how the rebelliousness becomes integrated into mainstream society and then is no longer rebellious, right? And then he talks also about how rebelliousness becomes institutionalized, like the museums take over the avant-garde artists, and therefore they kind of lose their edge. So there is this questioning that arises in Paz around the question of the issue of rebelliousness, of breaking with tradition in different realms, not only in the artistic realm, but also in the social and cultural realm. And the last point I will make, this is also very interesting about the move from the 1940s to the 1960s. Some point in the mid-1970s, Paz gives an interview with Spanish television. You can find it on the internet. It's a great interview. And at one point, the Spanish interviewer, the journalist, asks him, so what do you think of the Chicano movement? And is there a connection between the Chicano movement, which emerges in the 1960s, and the Pachucos? And he gives a very interesting answer, and he says, yes, there is a connection. The Chicanos are Pachucos with a political consciousness. And what he means by that is that you'll recall that I mentioned that Paz describes the Pachucos as instinctive rebels. In other words, they're just rebelling spontaneously because they're angry and because they want to express themselves. They're not pursuing a particular or not acting in response to a particular ideology. They're not trying to bring about specific social change. They're not political. That's what Paz expresses in The Labyrinth of Solitude. And he takes up that idea in the mid-1970s when he's talking about the Chicanos. He says, yes, the Chicanos do have a political program, and that's what they add, right, to the figure or the tradition of the Pachuco. They add that political consciousness. But the interesting thing in that statement is kind of ambiguous from Paz's point of view, because throughout his life, he was actually a critic of ideology, and he was very romantic in the sense that he was always defending spontaneity, right, in your personal life, but also in the public realm. And that's another reason why I think that he sympathized with the Pachucos, because when he says they're instinctive rebels, he's actually placing them in that romantic tradition where spontaneity, directness, like intuitive and impulsive behavior are highly valued. And from that point of view, maybe having a political consciousness from Paz's perspective isn't necessarily such a good thing, because he also loved to criticize abstract thinking and, as I mentioned, ideology. He thought those were all problematic and kind of distorted life. And yeah, in summary, I think the Pachuco for him is kind of instinctive life, and he felt attracted to that. But thank you for your question. Yes?
Thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening, wonderful.
Thank you.
I was wondering, you mentioned that he talked a lot about the braceros and the pachucos, but as we know, the program, the bracero program, was ended by the United States, and the result of that, or actually after that, was the creation of the maquiladoras all over northern Mexico. So we have maquiladoras here in Ciudad Juarez, in other parts. Now that effect, that whole political movement and economic, of course, movement changed a lot of the relationships, if you wish, in Mexico. Does he ever address that issue at all? Is he, because you also mentioned that he was a kind of supporter of feminism and so on.
Yeah.
Did he see that the position of women in the maquiladoras contributed to the changes in the, not only in the family structure, but the structure of society in Mexico in general?
Thank you for that question. Well, my answer has two parts. In the first place, in the early 1990s, Paz was a supporter of NAFTA or TLC, because he believed that that's the way that Mexico could modernize its economy. You know, this was the era of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the ideology of free trade became very strong, and Paz was a supporter of free trade. He thought it would benefit Mexico, so he supported NAFTA. He did pronounce himself on economic themes like that. However, when you specifically raised the question of the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, and the changes taking place there, my impression is that he overlooked that he didn't really, I mean, he was editor of 2 monthly cultural magazines between 1971 and 1998. So when he returned to Mexico after resigning as ambassador to India, he launched first a magazine called Plural, and then from 1976 another magazine called Vuelta. And I've actually read through most of the issues of these magazines, also looking for, because I'm interested in how he addresses the question of the relations between Mexico and the United States. And he's not, I don't see any evidence that he was interested in the border region as a sort of an autonomous region, as some scholars argue, that it's like a third space separate from Mexico and the United States. He wasn't interested in questions of hybridity that scholars who work on the border sometimes discuss. Like, you know, but on the border you find these hybrid identities that mix the Mexican and the American. In that way, he tended to be more, you know, first of all, he always had a very broad outlook on topics. And when he discussed Mexico and the United States, he tended to place that relationship in a very broad historical context. And he would say, well, the United States was colonized by England and we were colonized by Spain. And Spain and England both belong to Western civilization, but they're kind of opposite poles within Western civilization. So the United States and Mexico are also kind of opposite poles, culturally speaking. So he seemed to be most interested in establishing contrasts, and I think that's one of the reasons why the US-Mexico border region, which is where contrasts start to dissolve, right? Why it didn't really interest him so much.
Yeah, nonetheless, he also addressed the fact that half of this whole region is really Mexico, rather than, the United States. So we have, parts of Texas, parts of California, the whole,
Mhm.
Arizona and so on. These were part of Mexico. And what happened, how were people assimilated, and what happened
Yeah.
in that relationship there. But I
That's a very interesting question, and Paz didn't, as far as I can recall. Obviously he was aware of that. He knew the history of the relations between Mexico and the United States, but he never, as far as I can recall, he never really talked about it. He didn't necessarily always have a favorable view of the United States, but I think that he was very concerned with advancing good relations between Mexico and the United States. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that about the loss of Mexican territories to the United States, because Enrique Krause, who is one of Paz's closest collaborators until his death, and basically took over, launched a new magazine that was the inheritor of the magazine that Paz edited. In the 1980s, he wrote an essay in which he said he criticized Carlos Fuentes for talking about what he called TTT, el terrible trauma de Texas, which is the loss of Mexico's loss of its territories to the United States. And interestingly enough, Krause was very dismissive of that, and for me it kind of captures part of the intellectual climate of the era. He said, we don't care about that anymore, we've forgotten about that. That's what Krause said. But a few years ago he published an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he complains that the theft of Mexican territory by the United States in the Mexican-American War is not studied in the United States. And he says this is something that is still a matter of great importance, and that history needs to be studied. So I mention this because I find it interesting how points of view change over time. And back in the 1980s, when Mexico was trying to draw closer to the United States, people like Krause and Octavio Paz didn't talk about that history because they thought, it's better to leave that behind us. But as times change, those same people start saying, no, this is an important subject that should be addressed. So I wouldn't be surprised if Paz, if he had lived another 20 years, maybe he would have said the same as Krause and said, this is an important subject that needs to be brought to the forefront of our awareness more than it is now. But thank you for your question. I think maybe there's time for one more question, or should we move on to the reception? I gather that... Okay, well, thank you very much for your attendance. And Dr. Perry is going to say a few words in closing.
Just very briefly, I'd like to thank once again UTPB, the Odessa Council of the Arts and Humanities, and the Latin American Writer Series for sponsoring this, and very much want to say thank you for attending this. Very quickly, I'd like to thank these institutions. It might surprise you to learn that all of these followed us on YouTube streaming. So very quickly, La Universidad Autónoma de Chihuahua, the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, the Fundación para las Letras Mexicanas, San Diego State University, Midwestern State University, University of the Pacific, University of Texas Arlington, Wayne State University, Eckerd College, Universidad de Ciencias y Artes de Chiapas, y Miguel Ángel Mendoza del Instituto para la Cultura de Municipio de Ciudad Juárez, Alfa Escobedo, del Dirección General de Difusión Cultural y Divulgación Científica, UACJ, Comité Editorial Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, Centro Cultural Mexicano Paso del Norte en El Paso, Texas, Centro Cultural Paso del Norte en Ciudad Juárez, Secretaria de Cultura de Chihuahua, y Centro Cívico Smart de Ciudad Juárez. And lastly, and most importantly, to Professor Van Delden, who I also want to note has donated his work to the UTPB Dunnigan Library. So once again, thank you all, and thank you to Dr. Van Delden.